Good day to you. I hope you are enjoying the learning of class 12th Political Science, Contemporary World Politics. Now I am here to discuss the next chapter of your syllabus, the new centers of power. And before I talk about the detailed topics, let me quickly have a recap of what we've already discussed in the previous two chapters. In the first chapter, we talked about a world which was divided into two poles, the capitalist led by the US and the communist led by the USSR. We spoke about the Cold War and we also talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the second chapter, we talked about the disintegration of one of the camps. That means now the world was no more a bipolar but a unipolar world existed. And America became the only superpower after the disintegration of the USSR in 1991. Now in this chapter, we discuss that apart from the US, which are the other centers of power which can be considered as an alternative to America. Therefore, in this chapter, you should be able to understand a few power centers which can definitely challenge the supremacy of America. Four of them are European Union, ASEAN, China and Japan. In this chapter, we shall also very quickly look into the relationships that India and China enjoy. Now, the moment the Second World War came to an end, many of the European leaders were faced with a question which is called as the question of Europe. Should Europe revert to the old rivalries? That means all the countries of Europe, they were divided. So after the Second World War, when they knew that they have fought together, should they now again start fighting? You will obviously say, no, why should they be fighting? At the same time, there was also a situation when these economies were completely ruined. Why? Because they had spent so much of money in these two world wars. So the period of the Cold War, it actually helped the integration of these smaller European countries under the leadership of America. After the Second World War, these European states' economies were really in bad shape. So America extended a massive financial help to revive the European economy. And this plan of help is known as Marshall Plan. So under this Marshall Plan, the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, that is OEEC, was created. And this was in 1948 with the aim to channel the aid to the West European states. That means America proposed to help the European countries. Then it became a forum where the Western European states began to cooperate on trade and economic issues also. And hence, in 1949, the Council of Europe was established. In 1957, the European Economic Community was established. I hope you are understanding that with this small financial help that America did, gradually it turned out to a bigger cooperation in terms of trade and economy. Not only this, the economic cooperation soon converted itself into a political liaison also. And the political dimension was evident from the creation of the European Parliament. With the collapse of the Soviet bloc, the Europe definitely aimed to build a union at a much faster rate. And therefore, in 1992, the European Union was established. This foundation had a few common things, like they wanted to have a common foreign and security policy, cooperation on justice and home affairs, and the creation of a single currency, they actually acted like a nation state. They had their own flag, and you need to understand that this European flag has, it's a circle of golden stars, which means solidarity and harmony. And there are 12 stars. That means the 12 is a number which is symbolic of perfection, completeness and unity. This is an important question from the examination point of view as to what is the kind of, what does the European flag symbolizes. So you see, the European Union developed its own anthem also, and they celebrated the founding date also. They became the world's biggest economy. EU's combined GDP and the world trade was much higher than that of the US. The combined forces of the EU, the combined spendings on defense, the source of space and communication technology that the EU has is the world's second largest. They had the privilege of having two permanent members of the UN Security Council, that is Britain and France. But unfortunately, Britain decided to leave the EU. We very commonly have heard this word Brexit, that is Britain exiting the EU. Despite the fact that Britain would be leaving the EU, EU still is a very strong alternative center of power for America. And in times to come, definitely the union amongst the remaining members should be strong enough to put a brave front. Now let us look at the second new power center, that is ASEAN. It was in 1967 when 5 countries, that is Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore and Thailand, they signed the Bangkok Declaration and formed an association of Southeast Asian nations. Later on, 5 more members joined and now there are 10 members. The primary objective of the ASEAN was to accelerate the economic growth. That means to increase the rate of economic growth, which will thereby lead to social progress and cultural development. The secondary objective of ASEAN was to promote overall peace and stability in the South Asian region. There is a term very formally asked in questions, that is ASEAN Way. It's a very important question also. ASEAN Way is a form of informal interaction amongst the members. This interaction was aimed to be cooperative and non-confrontationist. That means they will cooperate, be friendly with each other, they will not fight with each other. That's known as an ASEAN Way. So if there is any dispute, any problem, they will sit down and mutually and cordially solve that problem. Now, to achieve its objectives, in 2003, ASEAN established 3 communities. They call it as the 3 pillars also. The first of them was security. So under the security community, the idea was that there should be no territorial dispute to an extent that it could lead to an armed confrontation. That means there should be no fighting. If there is any conflict, it should be sorted out cordially. The members promised to uphold peace, neutrality, cooperation, non-interference and respect for the national differences. Then they also worked for the establishment of the ASEAN Regional Forum. We call it as ARF. This was established in 1994. Now this ARF is an organization that carries out coordination of security and foreign policy. Therefore, one of the most important pillars for the ASEAN community. The second pillar was the economic community. You'll be surprised to know that if we put together all these 10 member countries of ASEAN, they stand nowhere in comparison to the US, EU, Japan, etc. Yet, their economy is growing much faster than all of these. So, the objectives of the ASEAN economic community was to create a common market and production base within the ASEAN states, to aid social and economic development in the region, And they also wanted to improve the existing ASEAN dispute settlement mechanism. They have a system where if there is any dispute on economic grounds amongst the members, so there is a mechanism in place which can be used to settle the dispute. So the economic community works to improve that system, to resolve those economic problems. Then they also have a FTA, the free trade areas. These are the areas where the trade would be with much lesser barriers in terms of investment, labor, services, etc. And the third pillar was the socio-cultural community. It gave out a Vision 2020, and it was defined as an outward-looking role for the ASEAN in the international community. And they have done it very well. You'll be glad to know that even India has signed the FTAs with the member countries of ASEAN, and India is very actively involved in the ASEAN affairs. In fact, we look forward to signing FTA with all the member countries of ASEAN. Now let me take you to another power center, China. Do you think China has the capacity to challenge the superpower America? Yes, quite possible. So let's get down to understanding China since 1949, when the People's Republic of China was made. So when China became a republic, they started on the model of exactly the same state-owned heavy industries, and everything was state-owned, just the way Soviet Union did. So they followed a communist model, but they had a shortage of foreign currency. So China decided to stop the imports from other countries, and they decided to produce these products in China itself. So the idea of having state-owned heavy industries producing goods which were otherwise being purchased from outside of China will definitely increase the employment in the country. Therefore, employment and welfare was assured to all by the Chinese government. And it gave wonderful results. The Chinese economy rose by 5 to 6%. The only problem was that their population also increased by almost 2 to 3%. Apart from that, the same problems which you have already talked about, the reasons behind the fall of the Soviet Union in the previous chapter, almost the same things happened here also, and China also faced these difficulties. That is low productivity, therefore low international trade, very low per capita income, corruption, etc. So in 1970s, China's leadership decided on having major policy reforms, and primarily the most important ones amongst them was to end the political and economic isolation. China was staying away from the world trade, but after 1970s it was decided that they will start the business deals, and they did that first of all with the US in 1972. The Premier of China, Zhou Enlai, he proposed 4 modernizations: agriculture, industry, science and technology, and military in 1973. In 1978, the Premier Deng Xiaoping, he introduced the policy of open door. That means they were now open to the foreign investment and to the foreign markets. The trade unions also were allowed to start movements. The trade barriers were reduced, though these were only reduced in the SEZs. SEZs are the special economic zones. These are certain geographical areas where the government gives incentives to the capitalist to come and establish their firms. So these are those SEZs which the Chinese government developed specially for the foreign investors. And most of these SEZs were developed near the coast so that the international trade transport would be easier. And very soon the results of these reforms were there. There was rise in agricultural production, the personal savings increased, the foreign trade and the foreign direct investment also shot up. But then, was everything going good in China? Probably no. The unemployment rate increased in China, with nearly 100 million people looking for jobs. The female employment and conditions of work began to be deteriorating further and further. The environmental degradation stepped in, corruption increased, there was inequality in terms of economy between the rural and the urban residents. So there were a lot of problems despite the reforms introduced. Now let us conclude. Given these reforms and given the drawbacks, what do you feel? Can China be an alternative to the US? Probably you've guessed it right. Yes, China has become a global economic power and has the potential to threaten the unipolarity of the world system. If China is so strong, what kind of relations do we have with China? Let us quickly look at that. Before industrial revolution set in and before imperialism started, both India and China were great Asian powers. However, when the European countries came and took over various parts of Asia, there was very limited political and cultural interaction between the two of us. After Britain left India, so after India became independent, we started on a very positive note with China. So in 1949, when the Chinese Republic was declared, India was almost one of the founder countries to have acknowledged their establishment. There was a very famous slogan also given during those times, Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai. Our problem started in 1950 when China established its supremacy over Tibet. We resisted. China obviously did not like this. And gradually we started having problems. In 1962, there was a border conflict on the territorial claims, principally in the areas of Arunachal Pradesh and in the Aksai Chin area of Ladakh. China and India both claimed that these areas were theirs. It resulted into a conflict and India suffered huge military losses. The losses were not only militarily poor for India, but diplomatically also India-China relations saw the worst times. Our relations improved a bit in 1988 when Rajiv Gandhi visited China. It provided an impetus to the improvement in our relations, and we tried to work on peace and tranquility. That means that we would work for the regional stability and peace and will not indulge in any conflicts. We even agreed to work on cultural exchanges and cooperation in both science and technology. We opened 4 border posts for trade also, and India is a very big market for the Chinese products. But is everything good between India and China? Probably not, because we suspect that China is Pakistan's friend. We feel that it is helping China China is helping Pakistan in developing the nuclear programs, and we also feel that the friendship that China is proposing towards Bangladesh and Myanmar, probably these are only to encircle India strategically. So we have a mix match kind of a relationship with China. Let me now take you to the 3rd largest economy in the world, Japan, and let's discuss whether it can become an alternative center of power. I'm sure you remember that during the Second World War, America had dropped atom bombs on the 2 cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945. And Japan surrendered unconditionally and it decided to leave the war. It had huge biological, economic repercussions also. But today, China is known for the high-tech products and the brands like Honda, Suzuki. They are the 10th most populous nation, but the second largest contributor to the regular budget of the UN. Almost 20% of the budget of the UN is sponsored by Japan. Japan does not have a military. They have a security alliance with the US, and it is in place since 1951. But they do spend 1% on military expenditure. This 1% of the GDP which they spend on the military expenditure may sound only 1%, but remember, it is the fourth largest in the world. So now, I come back to the same question. Do you think Japan can act as an alternative center of power? Well, that was a discussion in this chapter. We've spoken about the EU, ASEAN, China and Japan as the new evolving centers of power. With this, I hope you've understood not only the theory part of your chapter of political science, but also you've understood the practical world in which you are living. Happy learning, students. All the very best. Thank you.